There is a stigma attached to being a mobile game developer. Starting off as a real game developer, you get cut some slack for the most part, but if mobile games are your bread and butter, it tends to be an issue for a lot of gamers. Maybe it's the super dull gameplay loops meant to keep your eyes and wallet in game, and gacha deserves its own special place in horny jail, as well as tax jail. There are a few who can make it out alive to cross over to the other side successfully, and Shift Up is definitely one of those names. With their first title on a console, Stellar Blade, they have literally shifted up to a new standard of game for themselves and new expectations from gamers. Following Eve on her path to rid the planet of monsters from Mother Sphere is really a treat, and there's a lot to like about this game. It does, however, suffer from some first game pitfalls that I'm not sure this developer was ready for. Will Stellar Blade end up in the good graces of its god in the religious allegory, or will it find its place in horny jail as well? Grab your magic hair sword and suit up in your skimpiest clothes to drop into Stellar Blade's loop. Stellar Blade has a lot to live up to with just the style of game that it is. Reaching deep into the Souls-like mechanics and contending with many other titles that have done the same in recent years, there didn't really feel like much room left for another title, let alone another potential series in this space. Stellar Blade easily clears that bar, mixing in more than just Souls mechanics into its brew. The combat itself feels a lot like Devil May Cry or Final Fantasy XVI, with certain aspects of abilities and how they manage to flow together, as well as some of the special variants of dodging and countering in combat. There are markers on screen to commit to certain actions, and one wrong step can lead to certain doom. The movement itself feels very solid when in combat, but not as great when just running around the world. Many times the traversal can be a bit infuriating and doesn't quite line up the way you would expect it to, with balance beam mechanics and wall climbing mechanics feeling a bit clunky compared to other adventure-style contemporaries. I wouldn't say they're as clunky as the original Tomb Raider games, which recently got a remake and I played right here on stream, but it does lean to games of that ilk from more modern times. One thing I haven't seen much of in other games recently is QuickTime events. There aren't many, and they aren't very long or detailed, but just having some extra action in the game of these cutscenes is fun, and this is probably the right amount of QTEs to have in a game. Overall, the blend of mechanics and styles of gameplay seen in this title deserves a lot of respect to a company that probably hasn't had to deal with controllers on any of their previous titles, being mostly on touch-enabled devices like cell phones and tablets. Really, the game surprised me with just how tight it is compared to other Souls-like games from recent memory. Now again, I haven't played any of From Software's games previously, so I can't compare it there. But compared to Rise of the Ronin and the Jedi games, it feels really good and looks really good too. I mean, at least it looks like a game from this console generation. The world of Stellar Blade is probably the most bland part about this game though. Much of the game is painted desert orange or takes place in a sewer system or metallic laboratory. The few parts of the game that stand out are the destroyed cities that you visit, Zion, the capital city of the game, and probably my favorite part, a freaking space elevator. For a game based on reclaiming Earth from spaceships and a name like Stellar Blade, I was hoping to see some sci-fi like scenery and not a mishmash of The Last of Us and Dune's Arrakis. But given the story and some of the things that have happened to Earth in the game's lore, I guess I can't be too mad. You start off walking around decrepit cities and work your way through learning about the game and its mechanics until you fly off in a spaceship to the last bastion of society, Zion, possibly hinting at more of the game's religious undertones or being a one-to-one rip of the Matrix. You be the judge. You make your way through the city, see some fantastic tech at work, and then end up in a desert, then a creepy lab, then some more desert, another decrepit city, another desert, and another creepy lab. Then finally, the glory that is this sci-fi game's best section, the fucking space elevator. They literally made a whole level out of an elevator boss. I'm not weird, I don't have a thing for elevators, it's just something we haven't seen a whole lot in games up to this point, and I really thought that their implementation of it as something similar to an airport was the kind of realism in sci-fi that I enjoy. Now, could there have been some more destinations to the game that didn't just feel like asset flips of Broken City, creepy sewer lab, and desert? Yeah, there could have been. Did the world work as it was showing the effects on the planet after the fall of humanity and the rise of the Natiba creatures? Yes. It gives you a lot of the same eerie dread that The Last of Us does, with monsters around every corner and through every door, while managing to put you in a different perspective and see how things may have mutated differently in these biomes compared to others that you play through. Really, there was more thought in this than I give them credit for, and seeing how these different biomes and worlds come together to show this version of Earth is pretty stellar overall. The characters of Stellar Blade kind of start out as cardboard, but really gain their flesh throughout the time and gameplay of this game. From the moment we meet Eve, she has some very standard female lead tropes that make you wonder what exactly this game has to offer. But as you play through the intro and see some of the trauma she gets hit with early on in her time on Earth, Eve begins to expand and develop as a character. There are still a lot of holes in her personality that are either related to her backstory, which is next to nothing, or some connection to other characters that have no screen time. Case in point, Taki, and what she means to Eve, while literally being on screen for all of 15 minutes overall. What do these other characters mean to Eve or to the story? We don't really know, but the characters she does interact with give her the option to move forward and grow. We just don't know from what the baseline is, and it's left to its own interpretation. The next major character that we meet is Adam, and there are still questions on exactly what he means or who he is in lore, even after the end of the game. There are many times that he matters or is the knowledgeable one that gives the lore and plot points to the character, but then they hard pivot that to Lily about partway through the game and try to give Adam a whole new role. He goes from the scavenger type working for Zion and the rest of the human survivors to his end characterization in the game that really comes out of nowhere, and even with explanation, feels a bit too forced. Speaking of Lily, and coming out of nowhere, she literally comes out of nowhere. Having been stranded for 2 years in an alpha nest, she is a very different type of airborne than Eve. But everything she does comes in handy for all the upgrades and benefits that she can give to Eve. There's also a secret special Lily bar that does some things, so keep an eye as you finish quests early in the game. Lily breaks up a lot of the points of the game that either drag on a bit too long or get tedious, so I'm happy that they included her in this story as opposed to just Eve and Adam. Mother Sphere and the Naytibas are the next groups or characters to talk about, and we get a lot about them in various ways throughout the game. With Mother Sphere in particular, we learn about their origin and what their goals and desires for humanity and Earth really are as the game progresses. Mother Sphere is God, is what it boils down to, and her creations and the ramifications of her actions lead the game to its eventual choice, opening up many more opportunities for future titles in this world. The Naytibas are the big monsters you fight throughout your playtime, and their story is even more convoluted in many ways, but it is a really good play on the whole religious analog for demons and angels. They each have different abilities and actions that they take, but even the idea of them and how they came to be in their different states is an interesting storyline, even if we've seen many of these ideas in different games and media before. The game's heavy takes from Christianity and really even the Matrix, which also takes a lot from Christian allegory, lets you draw your own lines for how things come to be the way they are, and the characters that play around in this world lead you to some of those very same conclusions when you draw their parallels in the story. And that story comes up next. And while this is a tale as old as time, a lot of the plot points really make this game stand out on its own in comparison to its contemporaries. From the moment the game starts and the drop to Earth happens for Eve and her squad, it's clear that this game is trying really hard to make a solid first impression, and for the most part it succeeds. But when you get to the planet and many of the controls feel a little clunky, it's more than a bit rough. From the rip, you start getting into fights and learning the mechanics that by the end of the game, you will be a pro at. During this drop, the squad and Eve's partner, friend, comrade, and god, Taki, is almost immediately nuked from orbit by a super strong Naytiba, and Eve is almost taken out in the process until Adam saves her, and this is where the story really begins, moving from locale to locale and repeatedly going back to Zion with Adam and eventually Lily to deliver power to the city and its spiritual leader, Oracle. Sounds a hell of a lot like Oracle, you know, from the Matrix. Oracle tells you that you need more power to fully rebuild the city, but if your mission to take on the Elder Naytiba is to be completed, you also need to find and slay 4 Alpha Naytibas for their Alpha cores to create the key to the Elder Naytiba's nest and slay the monster. Moving through the game, you hit some open world spots to do some side quests and find ancient sites of literal power to help bring Zion back to his former glory, while also going to fight Alphas from time to time. The coolest of which requires you to take a space elevator. You thought I was going to be done talking about that? And having one of the more emotional moments in the game where a side character is brutally killed after surviving the whole time up until now. Space elevator superiority. This is honestly the best overall section of the game and story and takes the term elevator boss to a whole new level. Good job here, Shift Up. After the elevator, the game starts very quickly to wrap up and starts unraveling as well. Many of the plot threads get stretched to almost breaking the lore in on itself, but leads to some cool character interactions and fights, so the rule of cool wins yet again, even if it is at the detriment of the story. The game has 3 endings, and I'm trying my best to be better about crazy spoilers in my reviews, so I'm not going to go into them. Just know that your options are siding with heaven, or hell to commit sci-fi original sin, and there are many, many ramifications to both sides of that choice. All in, the story could use more backstory and flesh, but the bones of the overall story are there and make me want to play more. Some of the jumps in what you're doing at any given time could have been better, but all in, the game holds together about as well as an early 2000s RPG, so take that for what you will. Stellar Blade has gotten a lot of comparisons to other games. Just ask all the other people that say we have Stellar Blade at home and hold up a copy of Nier Automata on Twitter and YouTube. The one that keeps coming up more and more though in the games I've been playing recently is the idea of Soulsborne. What is a Soulsborne game or a Souls-like game, and why does it appear on every genre list of solo games in recent memory? I want to first talk about the idea of genre and mechanics. I'm not quite sure when it happened, but we started to get to a level where games were not just divided by their generalized genre, but also by their specific mechanics based on a predecessor game. The first one I remember, though it probably isn't the first like this, is roguelike and roguelite from the 1980s Rogue, which at one time held some meaningful difference, and probably in some circles still does, but seems to have lost a bit of its bite in the last few years due to media and other explanations online. Generally speaking, it's a game that makes you start over from the beginning at death. Some brief examples are Dead Cells, The Binding of Isaac, Risk of Rain, and Hades, of which Hades 2 has been a fun time off stream for the last week or so. Great commuting game for rides on the trains of Chicago, for which these reviews are named after. There is another mechanics-based genre that is being thrown around on any game for the last 5 or 10 years, and that is Souls-like. Taking its title from Demon Souls and Dark Souls, generally speaking, it involves mechanics around difficult combat that relies on precise actuation of controls, semi-grindy mechanics, lots of bosses, and very limited healing abilities with RPG-like stat systems, as well as long animations that can break what the player wants to do very easily. I don't know when it started to be applied to other games, but the genre has been thrown around on games like Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor, Rise of the Ronin, Remnant and its sequel, and Lies of P in recent memory. Souls-like was never something that interested me. I played Dark Souls 2 for 5 minutes years ago, and I purchased Bloodborne as one of my first PS4 games, and never actually played it. The thought of these games was intimidating to me as someone who likes a story more than a challenge, and who had his fill with convoluted boss mechanics in his 2-decade-long obsession with the MMO genre. Souls-like mechanics have popped up all over the place, and in many cases, the surging of this trend has killed the hack and slash games of yesteryear, trading waves of enemies all flailing at you for hardy, burly enemies that take longer to finish than any relationship I've had in my life. I do miss my hack and slash title, and many titles that were in the genre have sequels from recent years, such as God of War, being focused on third person instead of the almost platforming style it started with on the PS2, and even Final Fantasy leaning closer to the Souls style with 16 than any game before it in the series. It seems like everything that was an action RPG 10 years ago is now a Souls-like, and I guess that means at some point I need to play the Souls games, since I've enjoyed a lot of the time I have put into other games like them that pay them homage. I just wish not every game followed this trend. Stellar Blade didn't need to be like this. It almost tried too hard with too many different pieces of games, but in the end it pulled it off, and I know that many people follow gaming trends, so it was an easy win for Sony, who still won't put out a remake of Bloodborne, cowards, and Shift Up, who made their first console appearance with this title. One thing that Souls-like and roguelike have done is given 2 proven ways for games to keep players invested after losing a challenge. Now, even though I enjoyed my time in this game, you know the issues are coming. There's a handful of issues to talk about here, and many of them I would be willing to chalk up to new studio issues, assuming that the studio is working with tools and engines it's never worked with before. Some of the physics, aiming with the railgun, and lock-on targeting have odd effects that don't really make sense in comparison to the contemporaries or even other parts of the game. Many of the game's environmental climbs and puzzles can be completely ignored once double jump is activated by Lily and Zion. I'm not entirely sure what the game wants from me as a player. Does it want me to use my abilities like there's no tomorrow? Does it want me to save them and my ammo? Should I be focused on the parry system and the special counters? Many times even some of the abilities can be completely ignored. The game wants you to find everything to fill up your Lily bar, but it isn't the same system as the other vendors' affection systems, and is nowhere in the UI or menus. Now, these could all be attributed to a rushed product with things that can be fixed or cleaned up in patches. But the game overall doesn't feel that rushed. It's been announced in one form or another to the public for a number of years at this point, so I'm not sure how this happened under Sony's watch, as well as the desire to make a good first impression as a studio and as a series. Some of the things that are far less easily forgiven are the completely dropped storylines and the overall shoehorn plot twist to the game, with the Elder Nativa being one of the biggest, and also, why didn't the Alpha Tracker go off in a few more places? Why did the Alpha Cores and the Master Core even matter? More importantly, the game doesn't even really show you getting all of the Alpha Cores, but dances right past that part to tie up this plot line and brush you on into the end of the game. It's frustrating to see stories that don't even try to cover the plot holes that it digs for itself. The last thing that I want to consider an issue, but really your mileage may vary, is the not so open world. There are two types of level design in Stellar Blade: the open sections and the on-rails sections. There are only a handful of open sections that must be traversed and completed to complete the main story, but for the most part they are completely unneeded except to add some side quests and pad out game time. Now, some of these side quests are an absolute joy to play, but they feel much like other parts of this game, cobbled together to hit as many media buzzwords as possible with one title, which isn't necessarily the fault of the developer. Pressure comes to different teams in different ways, but it should and would be nice to not have so much happening when the real core of the game is so good. In all honesty, Stellar Blade was an absolute delight to play. There was a lot of risk for Shift Up to take here, and not everything was a golden star for the game. But there was some fantastic moments. I had fun with most of the bosses. Maybe not the one that took me 2.5 hours to complete, but when we got it, it was a huge win for me, and I started to understand all the hype and why people like to watch Souls runs in Elden Ring. Great first showing, and if the endings have anything to say about it, I can't wait to see where Eve's star shoots off to next.